There are places in history where the air still hums with the echoes of the condemned, where the walls have absorbed the final screams of the forgotten. Some deaths are swift, some are merciful, but others are drawn out in agony, wrapped in horror, and sealed in silence. These are the most horrific female executions in history. Tales of queens, countesses, and killers whose final moments were filled with terror, betrayal, and the cold embrace of death. You may think you know their stories, but not like this, not in the way the darkness remembers. So brace yourself, because once you step into this world, there is no turning back. And now, we begin. The execution of Catherine Howard, the doomed queen's final hour. The Tower of London was quiet that morning, too quiet, the kind of silence that made even the guards uneasy. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone, rotting wood, and something else, something almost metallic. Blood had been spilled here before, and it would be spilled again. The walls knew, the ground remembered. Catherine Howard sat motionless in her chamber, her fingers ghosting over the delicate fabric of her gown, royal silk, though it did nothing to comfort her. It was meant to be the attire of a queen, but to her it was the burial shroud of a condemned woman. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what was coming. She had heard the rumors of how it would happen, how the axe would be heavy, so heavy that the executioner sometimes struggled to make a clean cut, how it might take 2 blows, maybe 3. She had tried not to listen when the whispers reached her ears, but how could she ignore them? She could hear the scraping of steel against stone from the courtyard below. The blade was being sharpened. The night before, she had been allowed a single candle. Its flickering glow cast jagged shadows on the stone walls, twisting them into grotesque figures that seemed to move when she looked away. She had tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind was too full of memories, of laughter, of the warm touch of a lover who was now long dead, his fate intertwined with hers. By morning the candle had melted into a pool of wax. The guards entered without a word. No fanfare, no pity, just duty. Catherine tried to walk on her own, but her legs were weak, her breath shallow. 2 men held her by the arms, their grips firm, their eyes averted. They had escorted prisoners to their deaths before. She was nothing special to them, just another body to be buried. As they led her through the corridors, the walls seemed to close in. She knew these halls well, had danced through them in gowns of gold, had once been a girl who giggled with her ladies-in-waiting, oblivious to the knives being sharpened behind her back. Now every step was heavier than the last. The courtyard loomed ahead. The sky was an unrelenting shade of gray, a colorless void that swallowed the light. The scaffold stood waiting, draped in black cloth. The executioner, faceless beneath his hood, gripped his axe, testing its weight. The wood of the platform was stained, darkened from the deaths that had come before hers. The crowd had gathered, not as large as the one for Anne Boleyn, but still enough to fill the space with a restless energy. Some watched with bated breath, others murmured prayers. A few leaned forward, eager, hungry to see the fall of a queen. Catherine was forced to her knees. The executioner stepped forward, his movements precise, practiced. He had done this before. She was given a moment to speak, a moment to beg, a moment to say her final words. The air was so still her whisper could be heard by all. "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." A gasp rippled through the onlookers. Then the axe came down. A sickening sound filled the air, flesh and bone parting beneath the weight of steel. The body twitched, spasmed, fingers curling and uncurling as if trying to grasp something, life maybe, slipping through them like sand. The head rolled. It stopped just inches away from the executioner's feet, Catherine's eyes wide, frozen in an expression of shock that would never fade. The executioner bent down, gripped the severed head by its hair, and lifted it high for all to see. Blood dripped in slow, deliberate beads, pooling at his feet. A queen no more. Her body was taken away, dumped into an unmarked grave. No ceremony, no mourning. Just another forgotten soul swallowed by history. But not completely. They say, even now, in the dead of night, the Tower of London still echoes with the sound of running footsteps. A woman's voice, high and panicked, whispering pleas for mercy. A shadow moves along the walls, a flicker of a girl in a white gown, always just out of sight. A warning. A memory. A ghost. The execution of Elizabeth Báthory, the Blood Countess's dark end. The villagers whispered her name in hushed tones, their voices trembling as they spoke of what lay beyond the looming gates of Szejté Castle. For years the rumors had spread, of missing girls, of blood pooling in darkened corridors, of screams that pierced the night and faded into silence. They called her the Blood Countess. Elizabeth Báthory had once been a noblewoman of unimaginable wealth and power, her beauty whispered about in courts across Europe. But beneath the pearls and silks, beneath the carefully painted face, there was something else. Something dark. They said she bathed in blood, that she drank it, that she lured young servant girls into her castle, promising them work, only for them to disappear forever into its stone walls. The villagers saw the carts leaving the castle under the cover of darkness, wooden wagons carrying something heavy, something covered in sacks that dripped red onto the dirt road. And then one night, a single girl escaped. She was half dead when she stumbled into the village square, her body covered in deep, festering wounds, her fingers broken, her skin torn as if by teeth. She whispered of dungeons beneath the castle, of torture chambers lined with rusted iron hooks, of screams that never ended. The Countess, she sobbed. The Countess had done this. The king's men came soon after. They broke down the gates, stormed the castle with torches blazing. What they found inside was worse than any nightmare. The grand halls reeked of death. The stone walls were smeared with dark, dried stains, and the floor was littered with discarded, torn garments, too small, too delicate, belonging to girls who would never wear them again. In the lowest chambers of the castle, they found the truth. Bodies hung from the ceiling like slaughtered livestock, their throats slashed, their blood dripping into carved basins. Some were still alive, barely, moaning, twitching, their skin flayed open in grotesque patterns. There were iron cages too small for a body to fit in, but the bones inside proved otherwise. There were racks, iron maidens, a chair of spikes where a body had been left to rot, and at the center of it all, Elizabeth Báthory. She did not scream, she did not weep. She only smiled, as if she knew they had come too late. The trial was swift, the evidence was undeniable, but she was a noble woman, too powerful, too connected to be executed like a common criminal. They would not grant her the mercy of the axe. Instead, they prepared something worse. The masons worked through the night, sealing the windows of her bedchamber with thick slabs of stone. The only opening left was a tiny slit, just wide enough to pass through a small plate of food, a cup of water. And then the door was shut, the nails driven deep, the locks clicked into place. The Blood Countess was entombed alive. For the first few nights, the guards heard movement inside, footsteps pacing, a soft scratching against the walls, like fingernails dragging across the stone. Then the screams began. They echoed through the castle, a shrieking, guttural wail that lasted for hours, sometimes days. No one spoke of it. No one dared approach the chamber. Weeks passed. The screams grew weaker. Then silence. When they finally opened the room, years later, they found only a husk of what had once been Elizabeth Báthory. Her nails had been worn to the bone from clawing at the walls. Her lips were cracked, her hair matted. Her once beautiful dress was stiff with filth and decay. She sat slumped in a corner, her lifeless eyes still open, staring at the door that had never opened for her. But even now, the villagers say, on certain nights when the wind howls through the ruins of Szejté Castle, a woman's voice can be heard whispering through the stone, begging to be let out. The execution of Darya Saltykova, the Countess of Torment. The prison cell was damp, the walls sweating with moisture from years of decay. Rats scurried in the corners, their claws scratching against the stone, but Darya Saltykova barely noticed them. She sat still, her eyes fixed on the far wall, where the torchlight flickered, casting grotesque shadows that twisted and curled like the screams of her victims. She had been a noble woman once, respected, feared, untouchable, but not anymore. The guards outside spoke in hushed tones. They refused to look at her directly, as if fearing she could still curse them with a glance. Even in shackles, even starved and filthy, she unsettled them, because they all knew what she had done. They had found the bodies, dozens at first, then hundreds. Peasants, young girls, servant women, beaten to death, their corpses thrown into mass graves like discarded waste. The walls of her estate had been soaked in blood for years, but no one had dared speak out against her. No one had dared accuse a woman of such rank of such monstrous things, until the Tsarina herself intervened. Catherine the Great had ordered her arrest. A trial had been held, but the evidence was overwhelming, sickening in its detail. They said Saltykova had tortured her victims for amusement, that she had delighted in their suffering, breaking bones, whipping flesh until it split open like fruit. The testimonies were endless. The survivors, those who had managed to crawl away before she could finish them off, spoke of the screams that filled the halls of her estate, of the way the Countess would laugh as she held burning candles against their skin, watching them writhing in agony. Her punishment had been decided. She would not be granted death. No, death was too kind. They had prepared something else. The bells tolled over Moscow as the day of her sentencing arrived. The crowds had gathered, thousands of them pushing forward, eager to catch a glimpse of the woman who had become legend. The wooden platform stood in the center of the city square, a massive block of stone at its center. A chair had been bolted to it, its arms and legs reinforced with iron restraints. She was led out, chains dragging against the cobblestones. The people jeered, spat, hurled curses at her, but she kept walking, her head held high. Even now she refused to show fear. The executioner was waiting. His hands were thick, calloused, stained from the work he had done before. But he would not need his axe today. Saltykova was forced onto the chair. The iron restraints snapped shut around her wrists, her ankles. She did not struggle. She only blinked against the harsh sunlight, as if mildly inconvenienced by the day's events. Then they brought out the sign. A massive wooden slab, painted in bright red letters, was hoisted above her. Torturer and murderer of innocence. It would hang above her head for hours. For one full day she would sit here exposed to the people while they screamed their hatred at her. They would throw rotten food, spit on her, curse her name. She would have to listen to the families of her victims, mothers, fathers, daughters, howling for justice, for vengeance. And then, when the sun finally set, she would be taken away. Not to death, to something worse. The carriage rattled through the streets as they dragged her to her final home, a tiny windowless cell beneath a monastery. No light, no warmth, only stone and silence. She was bricked in, sealed away like a ghost in her own tomb. A single slit in the door allowed for food to be passed through. For the first few weeks, the guards reported hearing her talking to herself, muttering, whispering, sometimes laughing. But as the months dragged on, the laughter stopped. The whispers turned to screams. For decades, she lived in darkness, unseen by the world. When she finally died, they found her huddled in the corner of her cell, her nails worn down to the bone from scratching at the walls. They say the monastery is still haunted, that at night, if you press your ear to the cold stone, you can hear her whispering from the other side, begging to be let out. The execution of Marie Antoinette. The fallen queen's last walk. The morning was gray, the sky choked with thick clouds that threatened rain, but Paris was already awake. The streets were restless, alive with the murmurs of thousands. Today was not an ordinary day. Today, a queen would die. Inside the dark stone walls of the Conciergerie prison, Marie Antoinette sat in silence. Her once flawless hands, now calloused and trembling, rested in her lap. Her dress, a simple white chemise, was a far cry from the silks and jewels that had once adorned her. She was no longer the Queen of France. She was simply Widow Capet, stripped of her title, her dignity, her past. Outside, the guillotine stood ready. The wooden platform was stained from the executions that had come before hers. The blade had been freshly sharpened, the metal gleaming dully under the heavy sky. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, was a master of his craft. He had sent hundreds to their deaths with efficiency, precision. Today would be no different. But Marie Antoinette was not just another prisoner. She had once been the most powerful woman in France, a queen of unimaginable luxury. And now, she was nothing more than a spectacle for the bloodthirsty masses. She had heard the cheers when Louis had died, how the crowd had roared as his severed head was lifted high. Would they cheer just as loudly for her? A guard entered her cell. It was time. They bound her hands behind her back. The rough rope bit into her wrists, but she did not flinch. She had spent the past months in darkness, listening to the endless cries of those who had gone before her. She knew how this would end. As they led her through the narrow corridors, the air grew heavy, the scent of damp stone, unwashed bodies, and something else, something metallic, sharp. Blood, the scent of death. The cart was waiting outside. A rickety wooden wagon with high sides designed for criminals, for traitors. It had carried so many to the Place de la Révolution, and today it would carry a queen. The guards pushed her up onto the cart and the driver cracked his whip. The horses moved forward, the wheels creaking against the uneven cobblestones. The city was waiting. The streets were packed, thousands of faces staring, shouting, jeering. Some threw rotten food, others spat in her direction. "Whore!" they screamed. "Murderer! Parasite!" But others, older women, quiet men, watched in silence, their faces unreadable. They had seen what had become of France. They had seen the blood in the streets, the endless parade of the condemned. And perhaps, just for a moment, they felt the weight of what had been lost. Marie Antoinette did not cry. She did not beg. She did not speak. She only stared ahead, her back straight, her lips pressed into a thin, pale line. The guillotine loomed closer, its blade gleaming like a sliver of winter ice. The wooden steps, stained dark from so many executions, waited for her final ascent. Sanson stepped forward, his face unreadable beneath his powdered wig. He had done this too many times to count. She was no different. They untied her hands, preparing her for the final ritual. And then, as she stepped forward, she stumbled. Her foot struck the executioner's boot and she nearly fell. A gasp rippled through the crowd, and for the first time in hours she spoke. "Pardon me, monsieur. I did not mean to do it." A final courtesy, a queen's last words. Then they took her. They forced her onto the plank, strapped her down. The crowd roared. their voices rising in a deafening wave of fury and triumph. The executioner pulled the lever. The blade fell. A sickening sound, steel meeting flesh and bone. The head tumbled into the waiting basket, the once delicate face now frozen in empty silence. Blood gushed from the severed neck, soaking the wooden platform. Sanson lifted the head high for all to see. The crowd erupted, screaming, chanting. Someone dipped a cloth into the pooling blood, keeping it as a macabre souvenir. Others danced, sang. The Queen of France was no more. But they say sometimes, in the dead of night, if you walk through the Place de la Concorde where the guillotine once stood, you can still hear a whisper on the wind. Pardon me, monsieur. I did not mean to do it.